In the winter of 1959, 9 experienced hikers set out into the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains in Soviet Russia. None of them came back alive. What happened on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, a mountain whose name translates to Dead Mountain, remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. The official Soviet investigation concluded it was a compelling natural force that killed them, but the evidence tells a different story, a story of torn flesh and missing body parts, of strange burns and inexplicable radiation, of a government that sealed the files for decades, and a region that was immediately closed to the public. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, and what you're about to hear may explain why the Soviet Union worked so hard to bury the truth. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student with years of wilderness experience. His team was composed of fellow students and recent graduates, all skilled hikers, all in peak physical condition. Their plan was straightforward: a winter trek through the northern Urals, covering over 200 miles of snow-covered terrain. It was rated a Category 3 route, the most difficult designation in Soviet mountaineering, but for this group, it should have been routine. On January 27, 1959, they boarded a train headed northeast from Sverdlovsk. The next day, they reached the last inhabited settlement, a village called Vizhai. From there, they continued by truck to the edge of the wilderness. On January 28, they began their trek on foot. One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to illness. He was the only one who survived. Years later, he would say he considered himself the luckiest man alive, and also the most haunted. For days, the group moved deeper into the mountains, documenting their journey with photographs and journal entries. The weather was harsh, but manageable. Spirits were high. On February 1 street, they reached the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. They were one day behind schedule due to difficult terrain, but nothing seemed wrong. That night, they made camp on the mountainside. It was the last decision they would ever make. When the group failed to send a telegram confirming their safe return on February 12, concern began to grow. At first, delays were considered normal for winter expeditions, but by February 20th, families were demanding action. Search and rescue teams were dispatched. Volunteers, students, military personnel, even local Mansi tribesmen joined the effort. On February 26th, they found the tent. What they discovered inside would defy explanation. The tent had been cut open from the inside, long, deliberate slashes, made by knives, as if the hikers had been desperate to escape. But escape from what? Inside, everything was left behind: boots, coats, food, supplies, the kind of equipment you don't abandon in sub-zero temperatures, unless something has gone catastrophically wrong. And outside, in the snow, there were footprints, barefoot, or in socks, leading downhill toward the forest. The search team followed the trail. About a mile from the tent, near the edge of a forest, they found the first 2 bodies: Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko, both dressed only in underwear, both dead from hypothermia. But there was something else, something that didn't make sense. Between them were the remains of a fire. They had tried to stay warm, but nearby, branches on a cedar tree were broken at a height of 15 feet, as if someone had climbed up, frantically, looking for something, or watching for something. Over the next few months, the remaining bodies were found scattered across the mountainside. 3 more were discovered between the cedar tree and the tent, as if they'd been trying to crawl back. Among them was Igor Dyatlov himself. Then came the most disturbing discoveries. In May, 2 months after the initial search, 4 more bodies were found buried under 13 feet of snow in a ravine, and these bodies were different. Lyudmila Dubinina's tongue and eyes were missing. Her chest was crushed with a force equivalent to a high-speed car crash. Semyon Zolotaryov had similar injuries: massive internal trauma, broken ribs, but no external wounds. Nikolai Thibault-Brignola's skull was fractured. Alexander Kolovatov had strange burns and tissue damage. The medical examiner noted that the force required to cause such Injuries was far beyond what a human could deliver. He compared it to the impact of a car accident, but there were no cars, no avalanche, no external wounds, and then there was the radiation. Tests on the clothing revealed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. Not on all the bodies, just some of them. Why? How? The Soviet investigation, led by prosecutor Lev Ivanov, lasted 3 months. Witness testimonies were taken. Evidence was analyzed. Theories were proposed. And then, abruptly, the case was closed. The official conclusion: the hikers died from a compelling natural force. No further details. No explanation. The files were sealed and classified. Ivanov himself would later say he was ordered to stop investigating, ordered to close the case and move on. When asked why, he refused to answer. But in 1990, after the fall of the Soviet Union, he finally spoke. He said there were things he wasn't allowed to include in the official report, things he was told to ignore. He mentioned strange lights in the sky, orange spheres seen by other hikers in the area on the same night. He mentioned pressure from military officials, and he said, in his own words, "I knew there was something they didn't want us to find. So, what really happened on that mountain?" The natural explanations don't hold up. Hypothermia can explain some deaths, but not the crushing injuries, not the missing soft tissue, not the radiation. An avalanche? There was no evidence of one. The tent was still standing, barely damaged. And avalanches don't explain why experienced hikers would cut their way out and flee into the night without their gear. Wild animals? The medical examiner ruled that out. The injuries were too precise, too forceful, and animals don't leave radiation. So we're left with the unnatural explanations, the ones the Soviet government didn't want anyone to explore. Let's start with what we know. The Ural Mountains in 1959 were not an empty wilderness. They were a testing ground. The Soviet Union was deep into the Cold War. Nuclear weapons, chemical agents, experimental aircraft. All of it was being developed and tested in remote regions, far from prying eyes, and the Dyatlov group was trekking directly through one of those regions. In the years following the incident, reports began to surface about military activity in the area, unscheduled aircraft, restricted zones, patrols that didn't appear on any official map. Some researchers discovered that a secret military installation, known as Object 905, was located less than 30 miles from the site of the deaths. Object 905 was involved in classified weapons testing. The exact nature of the tests remains unknown, but documents declassified in the 1990s confirm it was operational in early 1959. Then, there are the lights. Multiple witnesses reported seeing strange orange spheres in the sky on the night of February 1st, and in the days following. These weren't isolated reports. They came from different groups, different locations, all describing the same phenomenon: glowing orbs, silent, moving in ways that defied conventional aircraft. Lev Ivanov, the prosecutor, mentioned these lights in his later interviews. He said the military told him they were launching rockets, but if that were true, why classify the details? Why shut down the investigation? One possibility is that the hikers stumbled into a weapons test. Perhaps a missile went off course. Perhaps they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but that doesn't explain the injuries, or the radiation, or why they fled the tent in terror, unless the weapon wasn't conventional. In 2019, a researcher named Valentin Yakomenko uncovered something disturbing in the Soviet military archives. A memo dated March 1959, just weeks after the Dyatlov incident, referencing neurological field experiments conducted in the northern Urals. The memo was heavily redacted. Most of the details were blacked out, but what remained was chilling. It mentioned exposure protocols, behavioral alteration, and unintended civilian interference. 9 hikers found dead in the snow. Was this a coincidence? Yakomenko believes the Soviet military was testing some form of psychological weapon, a device that could induce panic, confusion, or paralysis from a distance. something that could break the human mind without firing a shot. If such a weapon were activated near the Dyatlov camp, it might explain the irrational behavior, the sudden, frantic escape from the tent. The decision to run into the freezing night without clothing. It would explain why they climbed trees, as if desperate to see what was coming. Why they scattered in different directions. Why some appeared to have fought each other. Panic, disorientation, terror, not from cold, not from animals, from something they couldn't see or understand. And then there's the radiation. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union was experimenting with radiological weapons. Dirty bombs. Devices designed to spread radioactive material over a wide area without a nuclear explosion. What if the Dyatlov group was exposed to a test of such a device? What if the orange spheres witnesses reported were delivery systems? It would explain the contamination on the clothing. It would explain why the Soviet government immediately closed the area to the public for 3 years. And it would explain why they were so desperate to bury the truth. But there's another theory, one that's darker, one that suggests the hikers weren't just victims of a weapons test. They were test subjects, according to a former KGB officer who defected in 1992. The Soviet Union ran a covert program in the late 1950s exploring methods of psychological conditioning and behavioral control. The program, allegedly codenamed Kolod, meaning cold, sought to understand how extreme stress and environmental factors could be used to break human will. The officer, whose identity remains protected, claimed that remote military installations in the Urals were used as testing sites. Subjects were exposed to various stimuli, sound frequencies, light patterns, chemical agents to observe their reactions. Most subjects, he said, were prisoners or political dissidents, but sometimes, civilians wandered into the test zones by accident, and when they did, the results were classified. The bodies were recovered. The families were told it was an accident. Could the Dyatlov group have stumbled into such an experiment? Consider the evidence. The irrational behavior, the physical trauma that resembles the effects of extreme concussive force, similar to what's reported in acoustic weapon exposure. The missing soft tissue, which some theorists suggest could result from chemical exposure that accelerates decomposition, and consider the response. The immediate military presence at the search site, the seizure of evidence, the classified files. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was a containment operation. In 1997, a cache of documents was discovered in a storage facility in Yekaterinburg. Among them were photographs from the Dyatlov investigation that had never been released to the public. One photograph showed something in the background, behind the tent, a dark shape, out of focus, that didn't match the surrounding terrain. Analysts who examined the image suggested it could be a vehicle or a structure, something man-made. But when researchers requested the original negative, they were told it had been destroyed. Another photograph, taken from Semyon Zolotaryov's camera, showed strange streaks of light. The image was underexposed, damaged, but the lights were clearly visible. The official explanation was that the film had degraded, that the lights were artifacts, but photographic experts who analyzed the image disagreed. They said the lights appeared to be moving, captured in motion, and they were taken on the night of February 1 Street. Then there are the testimonies that were never included in the official report. Mansi tribesmen who lived in the region told investigators they heard strange sounds that night, a low hum, almost inaudible, that made them feel uneasy. One elder said his people avoided the area because the mountain speaks when pressed. He explained that sometimes you could hear a sound that wasn't natural, a sound that made you want to run. These statements were documented, but they were dismissed as folklore, superstition, or were they? Modern researchers have pointed out that infrasound low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing can cause feelings of dread, panic, and disorientation. It can even cause physical effects like chest pressure and difficulty breathing. Certain natural phenomena like wind passing over specific terrain can generate infrasound, but so can certain weapons. If the Soviet military was testing an infrasound device in the area, it could explain everything. The panic, the flight from the tent, the irrational behavior, and it would explain why the government wanted the case closed, why they sealed the files, why they threatened Ivanov, because admitting they'd accidentally killed their own citizens with a secret weapon would have been a disaster. Not just domestically, but internationally. The Soviet Union was already under intense scrutiny during the Cold War. An incident like this, if exposed, could have triggered diplomatic crises, protests, demands for accountability. So they did what they always did. They buried it, but the truth has a way of surfacing. In 2008, Yuri Yudin, the lone survivor who had turned back before reaching the fatal campsite, gave his final interview before his death. He was asked if he believed the Soviet government had told the truth about what happened to his friends. His answer was simple. No, he said he'd spent 50 years thinking about that night. 50 years going over every detail, every possibility, and he said he believed his friends had seen something. Something that terrified them so completely that they chose to run into the freezing wilderness rather than face it. When asked what he thought it was, he paused, and then he said, "I think they were never supposed to be there, and someone made sure they never left." Yudin died 2 months later. He never elaborated. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains officially unsolved. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation, citing advances in forensic technology and renewed public interest. Their conclusion? Avalanche. Despite the lack of evidence, despite the contradictions, despite the testimony of experts who examined the site and found no signs of an avalanche, the families of the victims rejected the findings. So did independent researchers. So did anyone who had actually studied the case, because the avalanche theory doesn't explain the radiation. It doesn't explain the military presence. It doesn't explain the lights, the missing tissue, the crushed bodies, the cover-up. It's a convenient answer. A way to close the case again, without admitting what really happened. But some truths can't be buried forever. In the decades since 1959, other incidents have been reported in the same region. Hikers vanishing, strange lights, unexplained deaths. In 1993, a group of researchers attempting to investigate the Dyatlov site were turned back by military personnel. No explanation was given. The area, officially, wasn't restricted, but they were told to leave immediately. In 2003, a documentary crew tried to film at the pass. Their equipment malfunctioned, batteries drained, cameras stopped working. One crew member reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and insisted they leave. They never finished the film, and in 2014, satellite images of the region showed unusual geometric patterns on the ground near the site of the original tent. Patterns that suggested construction or excavation. When questioned, Russian authorities said it was geological surveying, but the coordinates placed the site less than 2 miles from the Dyatlov Pass. What are they surveying? And why there? Maybe the answer is simpler than we want to admit. Maybe the Soviet Union was testing something in 1959. A weapon, an experiment, something they didn't fully understand, and maybe 9 people got in the way. Maybe the government decided it was easier to let them die than to reveal what they were doing. Easier to close the files than to admit the truth. Maybe they knew, even then, that some secrets are too dangerous to expose. That some experiments, once started, can never be fully stopped. And maybe, just maybe, whatever they were testing on that frozen mountain in 1959 is still being tested today, because the Soviet Union may have fallen. The files may have been declassified. The witnesses may have died, but the programs never really end. They just change names, get new budgets, new locations, new victims. The Dyatlov Pass incident isn't a mystery because we don't have answers. It's a mystery because the answers are too dangerous to reveal. And as long as governments operate in secrecy, as long as weapons are tested in remote places far from oversight, as long as the truth is considered a threat to national security, we'll never know what really happened on that mountain. Maybe we were never meant to. But there's something else. Something that's rarely discussed, but impossible to ignore once you know about it. The diaries. Igor Dyatlov kept meticulous records of the expedition. Daily entries documenting weather changes, group morale. The entries were recovered from the tent and entered into evidence. Most of them read exactly as you'd expect. Routine observations, technical notes, but the final entry, dated February 1st, is different. It's shorter. The handwriting is uneven, and it ends mid-sentence. The last line reads, "We are being watched." Strange lights to the "that's it." No period, no completion, just an abrupt stop. The official investigation claimed the entry was simply unfinished, that Dyatlov had been interrupted by something mundane, setting up camp, preparing dinner, but others who've studied the original document say the handwriting shows signs of stress. The letters are pressed harder into the page. The strokes are rushed as if he was writing quickly, urgently, and then there's Semyon Zolotaryov. He wasn't part of the original group. He joined at the last minute, replacing another member who had dropped out. At 38 years old, he was significantly older than the rest of the team. His background was unusual. He had military experience, had served in World War II, had connections to Soviet intelligence circles. Though his exact role was never clear, some researchers believe he was planted in the group, that he was there to observe, to monitor. But monitor what? After his body was found in the ravine, investigators discovered something strange. He was wearing 2 cameras around his neck. Both were damaged by water and snow, but one roll of film was partially intact. When developed, most of the images were too degraded to analyze. But 3 frames showed something: blurred shapes, possibly figures, possibly structures, and in one frame, what appears to be a uniform military Soviet. The photographs were confiscated. They've never been released to the public, and Zolotaryov's military records, sealed, classified under national security provisions. Why would the records of a World War II veteran still be classified 60 years later? Unless there was something in his file the government didn't want revealed. Then there's the testimony of Mikhail Sharovin, one of the searchers who found the tent. In an interview conducted in 2013, just before his death, he said something he'd never mentioned before. He said that when they first approached the tent, they saw tracks in the snow, footprints, but not just from the hikers. There were other prints, larger, heavier, made by boots, military boots. He said the lead investigator told them not to mention it, told them it would complicate the investigation, told them it was probably just from the rescue team. But Sharovin knew the timeline. The rescue team hadn't reached the tent yet when those prints were made. Someone else had been there. Someone who arrived before the searchers. Someone who left no other trace of their presence. Sharovin said he never spoke about it because he was afraid. Afraid of what it meant. Afraid of what might happen if he did. And he was right to be afraid. In 1963, another researcher named Viktor Popov began investigating the Dyatlov incident independently. He interviewed witnesses, collected documents, started piecing together a theory that the military was involved. In July of that year, Popov disappeared. His apartment was found empty. His notes were gone. His research vanished. He was never seen again. The official story was that he'd emigrated, left the country. No one knew where, but his family insisted he would never have left without telling them. And there was no record of him crossing any border. He simply ceased to exist. Another warning, another message. Some questions are too dangerous to ask. Fast forward to 2001. A former Soviet military engineer named Anatoly Gushchin published a book about the Dyatlov incident. In it, he claimed to have access to classified documents proving military involvement. He said the hikers had been exposed to a failed test of a thermobaric weapon, a fuel-air explosive designed to create massive pressure waves without traditional shrapnel. The weapon, he claimed, had malfunctioned. The blast wave hit the hikers' camp. The force was enough to cause internal injuries without external wounds. Enough to induce panic and disorientation. The government, he said, covered it up to avoid admitting the weapon existed. Gushchin's book sold a few hundred copies before it was pulled from circulation. The publisher claimed it was due to legal issues, defamation, unverified claims, but copies of the book became nearly impossible to find, and Gushchin himself stopped giving interviews. When contacted by journalists in 2005, he refused to discuss the book. He said only, "I was wrong. I made mistakes. Leave it alone." But those who knew him said he seemed frightened, that he'd been visited by men who identified themselves as government officials, that he'd been told, in no uncertain terms, to retract his claims. And he did. Because in Russia, even after the fall of the Soviet Union, some truths remain forbidden. There's one more piece of evidence that rarely gets discussed. The medical examiner's report on Lyudmila Dubinina. Her tongue was missing. So were her eyes. The official explanation was post-mortem decomposition, scavenging by animals or natural decay. But the medical examiner noted something unusual. The tissue around the missing areas showed signs of what he called precision removal, not torn, not chewed, removed as if by a blade or a tool. He wrote in his notes, "The nature of the tissue damage is inconsistent with known predation patterns." That line was included in the original report, but it was removed from the version released to the public. Why? What kind of animal uses tools? What kind of decay is precise? Or was it something else entirely? Some researchers have theorized that the missing soft tissue could be related to exposure to certain chemical agents, agents that selectively destroy mucous membranes and soft tissue while leaving bone intact. Such agents existed in Soviet military arsenals. They were used in experimental weapons research, and they would explain the injuries. The missing tongue, the missing eyes, not animals, not decay, exposure. The Soviet Union had a long history of testing chemical and biological weapons on its own people. Prisoners, soldiers, even entire villages in remote regions. It's documented. It's not conspiracy. It's history. So why is it so hard to believe they would test such weapons in the Ural Mountains? Why is it so hard to believe that 9 hikers stumbled into something they were never supposed to see? And why is it so hard to believe that the government would let them die to protect a secret? Because that's what governments do. They protect secrets at any cost. The Dyatlov incident isn't unique. It's just the one that got attention. The one that couldn't be completely buried. But how many others were there? How many expeditions vanished without a trace? How many bodies were never found? How many secrets are still buried in those mountains? The files may say the case is closed. The authorities may say it was an avalanche. But the evidence says something different. It says 9 people died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It says the Soviet government knew exactly what happened. And it says they chose silence over truth, secrecy over justice, because some experiments are too important to stop. Some weapons are too valuable to acknowledge, and some victims are simply expendable. The Dyatlov Pass incident will never be fully explained, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the people who have the answers will never give them. The truth died on that mountain in 1959, and it's still buried there today.